What the hell are you doing?
You said we were going to talk about Colts.
Colt motorcycles.
Oh.
Yes, it's Colt motorcycles. Those machines that command a loyal following. Often these machines can be rare and expensive, like the Honda 6. Now instead, let's have a look at some bikes that you don't need to sell your soul for just to afford the things. So here are 5 affordable Colt motorcycles. The Suzuki Bandit. Whether in its 400, 600 or full-on 1200cc versions, the Bandit has always commanded a great following. And it's easy to see why. It's a machine that has quite a lot of character, unusual for a Japanese machine. It's easy to live with, easy to maintain, and it's very easy to ride. You simply look where you want to go and the bike rolls with you. The 600 was the first to appear way back in 1995 and was an instant hit. It offered great value for money, reasonable performance, around 80 horsepower at the crank. The bike's performance was respectable and it offered unrivaled value for money at the time. 96 was the arrival of a 750, in some markets at least, not the UK, and the 1200. This was available pretty much everywhere, and the 1200, although only offering around 100 horsepower, was a serious hooligan tool, developing a ton of torque and accelerated like an absolute maniac. The bikes were built down to a cost. They used fairly cheap suspension and brakes. Nevertheless, they actually handled better than the GSXR and GSXF models on which they were based. They certainly steered much more easily. The Bandit is the bike that launched 1,000 Street Fighters, and is without a doubt very deserving of its place as a cult motorcycle. MZ. Now I can hear the hoots of derision already. The MZ is a machine that's created quite a lot of mirth over the years, in the way that Skoda used 2 years ago. But the fact is, MZ has a very loyal following. And let's not forget all those super exotic two-strokes from the 70s that came from Japan owe their existence to MZ. And some Cold War era industrial espionage, of course. MZ, or Motor Japar, is basically made up of what remained of DKW's factory that was caught on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain at the end of World War II. So not surprisingly, most of their early machines are very much based on the DKW RT125, which is not that unusual because pretty much every two-stroke post-war was largely based off this machine, and I'm talking about two-strokes by Harley, BSA and Yamaha, lest we forget. And the machines were successful in international 6-day trials during the 60s, as well as motocross and a series of Grand Prix wins on the track too. However, in Britain we really began to see these bikes in big numbers at the end of the 60s and into the early 70s, as replacements for the now defunct Villiers and VSA Bantam models. The Japanese models are for the most part being rather expensive, and these little machines are very robust, with many of their obsessive owners taking great pride in pushing the bikes over the 100,000 mile mark. And to this day the MZs, particularly the early 250 trophies, command a very loyal following, and not just in their native Germany. When they sold in Britain they had an excellent dealer network who managed to sell these bikes in quite respectable numbers. And survival rates are extremely high. A lot of the time you go to a classic bike meet and there may be more MZs than classic Japs, or at least as many. So these bikes are tough. Remember, they were built for a market such as Eastern Germany, where the riders would have to maintain the bikes themselves, there being very limited spares availability, and of course there were no swanky dealerships in the Eastern Bloc countries in the 1970s. Make to amend was rather more than a tagline that you got on a mug. But there is one downside to all this cult status business. When I purchased an MZ way back in the early 90s to commute on, the thing was absolutely dirt cheap. I think it was £124, and it gave me loyal service. It was great in winter and was as tough as they come. And weirder still, it's actually really enjoyable to ride, although not particularly fast of course. The bike had lots of clever, thoughtful little touches. You really got the impression that somebody had thought about what the bike actually needed to do its job. So when I think about it, it's not surprising at all that these machines have achieved some sort of cult status. The only downside is they're an awful lot more expensive than the £124 I paid way back in the early 90s, that's for sure. But the bike does still offer a fun, economic and reasonably inexpensive way into the classic bike market. The Honda CB400-4. The Honda CB400F arrived on these shores in 1975 and was based off an earlier CB350F, which was very popular for a time at least in the American market. The machine offered the kudos of a Honda 4-cylinder engine in a package that was much smaller, lighter and more nimble than their mighty CB750F. The machine sold in reasonable numbers, but surprisingly was only on sale for about 2 years, going off the market in 1977, mainly because Honda realised at the time that a 2-cylinder model was cheaper to make, lighter and offered similar performance, with of course very Honda bigger profits. The buzzy little engine offered just 37 horsepower, so it wasn't the quickest bike out there, but it sounded and looked really great, and that's what really made the bike catch on. But in its main market it was not commercially successful, which would of course lead to its early demise. But perhaps the true legacy of the 404 is that it led to that plethora of 400cc sports machines from the early and mid 80s and 90s. The Yamaha RD 250 and 350 LC models. Sometimes known as the RZ or RZ in some countries, or RD for race development in the UK, the machine is affectionately just known as the LC. Replacing the earlier air-cooled RDs, the LCs arrived in 1980. Both the 250 and the 350 were parallel twins with liquid cooling and reed valve induction. Now at the time of the bike's arrival in the UK, the 250 law was still in effect, in other words as a learner you could ride a 250. However, it is said that when the British government caught wind of the RD 250 and the fact the bike could top just over 100 miles an hour, then it was curtains for the 250 law, and the rest of us had to make do with 125s. So thanks very much Yamaha, thanks a lot. The original LC ran the same dimensions as the previous air-cooled model, to make 347cc's, but produced a claimed 49 horsepower, 46 in some countries depending on regulations. And with its all-new lightweight monoshock chassis, the machine accelerated and steered and braked pretty much as good as any other Japanese bike on the market at the time. And speaking from experience came the true dream bike of many teens of the period. I would have loved one of the things. The original machines ran until 1983 when they were replaced by the YPVS versions, effectively with an exhaust power valve. And this would give the bike improved mid and low range power, as well as more power at the top end too. And this system would allow Yamaha to claim an extra 10 horsepower at least on the top end. Now, production of the YPVS model would carry on until 1986, but the bike was so popular that a Brazilian-built variant was bought back in 1992, and that would carry on all the way until 1995. Now, I can see the great charm of these bikes is they offer a really raw riding experience. I've got very limited riding experience with these bikes, but what I can tell you is that when you open them up, they accelerate like a banshee and vibrate quite a bit too, but to me that just adds to the excitement, because the RD has a visceral feel that say a modern Ninja 400 could not hope to live with. And it's easy to see how this bike has achieved cult status. It offered big bike performance on a small bike budget. It put a lot of power in the hands of people who couldn't previously afford it. And for that reason alone it deserves its place on this list. The only downside is that prices now have really started to climb. The Harley-Davidson Sportster. Harley introduced their original Sportster in 1957 in an attempt to get some of the market back from those pesky British sporty parallel twins, and certainly it did achieve many of its objectives. Although it's still quite a heavy bike, it's nothing like the weight of the bigger Harleys, a fact which means that some Harley owners do pour scorn on the bikes as ladies' bikes. But this is just nonsense. Most bigger Harleys are just too big to be practical. What a Sportster offers is a really useful all-round package, particularly if you're using it on British or European roads. But of course, as a Harley, it's not mechanically perfect. There are a few downsides to these machines. The handling isn't bad at all, but then the ground clearance is pretty mediocre, especially two up you'll start to drag those exhausts pretty quickly. And of course the fuel tank range on some models is absolutely laughable. And then there's the vibration. Early models vibrate terribly. Later machines are fitted with rubber mounted engines, but even these models, when you push on, you can really feel the vibration coming through, rubber mountings or not. But for all that, these bikes are good fun to ride, and they've got a character all of their own, very different from the bigger, heavier Harleys with even worse ground clearance. And of course they offer a really good alternative to a lot of old classic British bikes, and believe me, the riding experience is not completely dissimilar. Now of course in Europe at least, the Sportster has been replaced by that rather bulbous looking water-cooled model, which I don't think looks nearly as nice, and it certainly won't sound as good as the original Sportsters. It may be on a mechanical level better, but does that mean it's better? I don't know. Because cards on the table here, I'm not a big Harley fan, not at all, but I did enjoy riding the Sportster. I thought it was a really nice bike, and I think I can understand how it would gain such a cult status. A bike for the individual, no doubt. Oi! Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.